behalf of Spirituality in the Pub, Spirituality on the Sofa, and Catalyst for a Renewal, welcome. 30 years ago, did you know, in the Bellevue Hotel in Paddington on the 7th of May, 1995, Spirituality in the Pub debuted. So it's a really exciting evening, and we're just delighted that you're all here with us. I acknowledge the elders of our Biripi land up here, of the past and the present and the communities, and invite you to think about the elders and the communities of the beautiful lands from which you're joining our Zoom tonight. As we're in the business of conversation, we acknowledge the important role that language and dialogue has played in our beautiful country. And we look to ongoing dialogue and conversation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. We work towards peace and good spirits and draw from the stories of the dream time, the waters, the birds, the animals, the children, nature, and we recognise the ongoing connection and the important connection between these aspects of Indigenous culture. We welcome all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander members of our Zoom this evening, and everyone is welcome. And I invite you to think about your feet on the ground, connecting with earth, connecting with the skies, connecting with the spirit. And even though we're Zooming from different mobs and lands, we're so connected. And I invite you just to imagine a string or an energy connecting all of these little faces on our Zoom. Part of our SIP community. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. So this evening, we have got two of our faves, I'm not going to say oldies, two of our original sippers tonight with us, because we're going tonight again to revisit our topics from 30 years ago. Our organising committee thought, what an interesting perspective to offer 30 years on. And did you know, at the Bellevue Hotel in 1995, our first topic for conversation was conscience, a modern context. And our speakers that night were Catalyst and SIP founding members Geraldine Doogue AO and Father Michael Whelan SM, who are with us this evening. Aren't we lucky to have had you both for 30 years? Our 30 years, we have hosted thousands of vital, life-giving conversations in venues from Perth, Western Australia, to Boston in the States. The COVID pandemic closed numerous venues, but we migrated very successfully online as Spirituality on the Sofa. In 2025, SIP continues at a small number of venues live, and SOS, our platform here, serves as a domestic and international online community. And I must say, we're pretty proud of our wonderful community and the conversations that we've continued to have. All right, so ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you a little bit more about Father Michael, parish priest of St Patrick's Catholic Church in the Rock, Sydney. Father Michael gained his PhD under Adrian Van Kuhn in 1984 in the USA. He's the former head of the Sydney College of Divinity, former principal of the Catholic Theological Union, and of the Aquinas Academy, Sydney. Father Michael is a published author and co-founding member, and of course, Spirituality in the Pub. So, Father Michael, over to you, and we have your slides and notes for when you're ready for those as
Okay,
well.
Susan, if you wouldn't mind putting up slide number 1, which is simply the heading, and just hold it at that one.
All right,
Good evening,
Pete's going to do that.
everybody.
Yeah.
Look, I recently came across, I don't know whether you can see that, a book by Jonathan Sacks called Morality, Restoring the Common Good in Divided Times. And I would like to begin with the words of Jonathan Sacks. I think they're very pertinent. So if you shift to slide 2, please, Susan or Peter. Can you go to slide 2, please?
Yeah, yes, Pete's going to slide 2. There
Love
we are.
your neighbour, love the stranger, hear the cry of the otherwise unheard, liberate the poor from their poverty, care for the dignity of all. Let those who have more than they need share their blessings with those who have less. Feed the hungry. Just a moment, I'm running out of power here. Fight injustice, whoever it is done by and whoever it is done against. And do these things because, being human, we are bound by a covenant of human solidarity, whatever our colour or culture, class or creed. These are moral principles, not economic or political ones. They have to do with conscience, not wealth or power. But without them, freedom will not survive. The free market and liberal democratic state together will not save liberty, because liberty can never be built by self-interest alone. I-based societies all eventually die. Morality is not an option, it's an essential. I think Jonathan Sacks, who was, before he died an untimely death about 3 years ago, was the chief rabbi in the United Kingdom. Anything I've read of his is superb, and I highly recommend this book. The reason I chose this particular quotation, I think it sets a modern context where all those things that Jonathan Sacks is emphasizing, love your neighbor, love the stranger, hear the cry of the otherwise unheard, we cannot take for granted anymore. And what I see is happening in our world, there is a fight for conscience. I don't think we can take conscience for granted anymore. And I will later refer to an essay by a man by the name of Packer, who wrote in the Atlantic, May issue of the Atlantic, an essay entitled Hollow Men, talking about what's happening in the United States at the moment, whereby people are not making conscientious decisions, but they're making decisions on the basis of fear or ideology. But I'll come back to that point because I think it's absolutely crucial, a crucial part of our conversation on conscience. Could you move to slide 3, please, Susan? Now, I thought it would be useful to share my own sense of journey on this, and the journey has by no means concluded. So some of the major shifts in my own thinking have been from conscience as exit towards conscience as entry. I think in the 1960s, when I first became aware of the tussle over conscience in the debates over the Vietnam War, I probably naively thought of conscience as a way out of a situation, that my conscience won't allow me to do this, so I move to one side, become a conscientious objector. I think that's still part of conscience, but I've become more aware of conscience as facing, of entering, of approaching reality more deeply. Conscience will probably take you where you'd rather not go at times. I would call it an essential doorway to adulthood. Second point, from primacy of I towards primacy of we. When I was first aware of the debates about conscience, it was about my conscience and what my conscience asked of me. I'm much more conscious of the social reality that conscience recognizes and engages each of us with the social reality. Number 3, from theoretical towards experiential. I was reading something of Pope Francis today, his closing address to the Synod on the Family, and he was berating those people who are tied to the letter of the law, a sort of a hostile intransigence. And he said, you've got to remember that God is full of surprises, and every situation needs to be taken as a new situation. I'm not moving towards saying there are no principles or that there are no objective realities. The very opposite is true. But just how you deal with any given situation demands some discernment and demands the possibility that we're open to what we haven't seen before, to learn. Number 4, from simple towards complex. Conscience brings us face to face with mystery. More and more I found, I've been a priest now for over 53 years. The more I know I don't know. And I'm very conscious of this in pastoral situations when I'm dealing with people. And in recent years, I've had some intractable moral issues that people are struggling with. There is no simple pathway that says, look, these are the rules, do it. We're on a journey and we move forward as into that which is unknown. And conscience has got to be part of that. And that's got to be factored into our understanding of conscience. Number 5, from given towards gain. Conscience is not just like your heart or your spleen or your toenails. Conscience is a growing phenomenon within each and every one of us, or it's not. And recalling what's happening, I think, in the United States and other parts of the world, we can't assume conscience is functioning in people. If the master of the ideology demands that I do this and I simply do what the master says, what I've done is bypassed my conscience. Instead of asking, well, hang on, what's right? What's wrong? Number 6, from head knowing to whole person knowing. Conscience as the voice of integrity of the whole person. It's not just a rational, conceptual phenomenon. Okay, Susan, move to the next or Peter, move to the next slide. This is a little diagram I found useful, starting with the notion of a social reality. We are together, we're interconnected. To be human is to be in relationship. To introduce the biblical revelation to it, we understand that God is the God who is with. The withness of God, we must assume, has been given to each of us as we're made in the image and likeness of God, who is with. Witness is part of your and mine, my reality. So to be is to be part of a community, to be interconnected. That implies social consciousness. That demands a social, that I become aware of my place in the community, my responsibilities, my limits, the needs of the community. Moving to social conscience, an awareness of what is good, what is not, because the social reality might be quite twisted and might lead me to a social consciousness that is actually wrong. And I may discover this through social conscience. When I grew up in Australia in the 1950s, I think there was a lot that was wrong. And I think particularly the way we've treated Aborigines. And I lived near an Aboriginal reserve in Wardell. And I would say my social consciousness at that time was very limited. My social conscience now would say to me, things need to change, which leads then to finally social presence, a way of being in the world, a way of being with in action and actively, experientially. The next slide, please, Peter. Paulo Freire has had a remarkable influence in this whole development of a new social consciousness. He came up with that word that I find, I'm not even going to try and pronounce it. It's Portuguese. He was a Brazilian. But one of the interesting phenomenon about Paulo Freire in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he, whether wittingly or unwittingly, realized that by making people socially aware and promoting conscience, social conscience, this undermined and was subversive to the ideology that prevailed. Autocracy does not want social awareness. And he was exiled from his own country, Brazil. But the world picked it up, and particularly it became a part of our Catholic tradition through liberation theology mostly. And the kind of, this Portuguese word is translated variously as conscientization, consciousness raising, critical consciousness. It implies that you're a human being who's capable of and required to think and learn and be open to possibilities. Now, that implies some basic attributes or dispositions: awareness, listening, openness, conversation. What I came to realize soon after we established spirituality in the pub was, if a conversation is to be real, if the conversation is to be conversation rather than simply debate or argument or simply sharing my point of view, the people who enter the conversation must be open to change through the conversation. If there's no openness to change, there is no conversation, no matter what it looks like. There may be confrontation, there may be contestation. And I'm very wary in talking about matters religious or things close to me. If somebody wants to raise a question with me, the first question I have is, do you want a contestation or a conversation? If it's a contestation, I'm not interested, quite frankly. If it's a conversation, yeah, let's talk. Both of us being open to learn from the other. Now, that kind of set of attributes, and there are others in the same mode, awareness, listening, openness, are very antithetical to ideologies of any kind and ideologues and propaganda and mass-mindedness and idealizations. I think ideologies are rampant in our world. We've seen dreadful examples of it in the 20th century with Nazism and fascism and communism, but we're not done with it. It seems like there is this inclination of people to find in an ideology in the strong man, and it is mostly strong men who put things together. It allays our anxiety. I referred to Packer's article in The Atlantic. I'm going to attach a quotation to the Word file, which, if you wish to get a copy of it, there's about 16 pages of relevant quotations to this discussion. He draws the similarity or the parallel with what Orwell says in his in 84, and it's alarming, let me tell you, because it's so accurate. The next file, please. St. Thomas Aquinas, a lot of people would be surprised to hear this. Every conscience, whether it is right or wrong, whether it concerns things evil in themselves or things morally indifferent, obliges us to act in such a way that she who acts against conscience sins. I'd wager that of the people here tonight, part of this discussion, that may be the first time you've ever heard that. Could we move to the next file, please? Next page. Pope John the 23rd, within virtually days, weeks of his death, published one of the most extraordinary encyclicals in the history of the Church called Pacem in Terris. Cardinal Sunens took it to the United Nations and tabled it there. My dear friend Tom Uren read pages out of it so it would go into Hansard for the future record. But here's a statement by John the 23rd. The world's creator has stamped our inmost being with an order revealed to us by our conscience. And our conscience insists on our preserving it. One of the dangers is to think of conscience as moving us in the direction of subjectivity or subjectivism. The very opposite is true. It's not an exit, it's an entry. It's an entry into objective reality, that each of us has the capacity and the obligation to go there. John the 23rd continues, we show the work of the law written in our hearts. Our conscience bears witness to them. Romans chapter 2, verse 15. And how could it be otherwise? All created being reflects the infinite wisdom of God. It reflects it all the more clearly the higher it stands in the scale of perfection. Psalm 18. Please move to the next slide. Vatican II, Gaudium et Spes. I'm sure you are all familiar with this quotation. In the depths, and incidentally, the church has no particular teaching on conscience. There is a tradition of teaching which is more or less mainstream, and these quotations are taken from that mainstream thinking on conscience. Gaudium et Spes, number 16. In the depths of our conscience, we detect a law which we do not impose upon ourselves, but which holds us to obedience, always summoning us to love good and avoid evil. The voice of conscience can, when necessary, speak to our hearts more specifically. Do this, shun that. For we have in our hearts a law written by God. To obey it is the very dignity of the human person. According to it, we will be judged. Conscience is the most secret core and sanctuary of a person. There we are alone with God, whose voice echoes in our depth. I think that's a beautiful explanation. Well, it's hardly an explanation, but a presentation of what conscience actually is. You can't define it. It's not something that submits to rational explanations. Next file, please. Pope St. John Paul II. Did I hear someone say, I beg your pardon? Well, let me tell you, this man has put some landmines in his doctrine, and slowly over the years we're going to discover them. First of all, Redemptoris Missio 1990, the church proposes. She imposes nothing. Now that comes as news to a lot of Catholics, I'm sure. She respects individuals and cultures, and she honors the sanctuary of conscience. And then in Veritatis Splendor, the importance of this interior dialogue, and this, I think, points to what Ignatius of Loyola would call discernment. You know, you don't just come up with answers. It's a process, and it never ends. The importance of this interior dialogue of persons with themselves can never be adequately appreciated. But it is also a dialogue of the person with God, the author of the law, the primordial image and final end of the human person. St. Bonaventure teaches that conscience is like God's herald and messenger. It doesn't command things on its own authority, but commands them as coming from God's authority. Like a herald when he proclaims the edict of the king. This is why conscience has binding force. Pope St. Gregory the Great, who died in, 601 or something, said almost exactly the same thing. Conscience is the voice of God. John Paul goes on, thus it can be said that conscience bears witness to our own rectitude or iniquity to ourselves. Together with this, and even beforehand, conscience is the witness of God himself, whose voice and judgment penetrates the depths of the human soul, calling the person forth strongly and gently to obedience. And finally, I think the piece de resistance, which John Paul II offers us, the great call to adulthood, to objectivity, to lay down our lives, in effect. So the church puts herself always and only at the service of conscience. Marry that with the statement for Redemptoris Missio. The church never imposes, it only proposes. And that too, sadly, is not well known by Catholics. So I'll draw a line under it there, Susan. And can I just say one thing? I'd prefer people to express their thoughts, what questions are arising for them, not to ask me questions as if I'm a guru. I'm not. I'll share with you my confusion if you like, but I'd rather you shed your confusion with me.
Thanks, Father Michael. Yes, confusion is a good state, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, ladies and gentlemen, we welcome Geraldine tonight, who is, of course, a renowned Australian journalist and broadcaster. Geraldine was honoured in 2003 with the title of Officer in the Order of Australia, AO, for distinguished service to the community and media related to ethics, values, religion, and social change. She was admitted to the Australian Media Hall of Fame in 2018 and holds several honorary doctorates from Australian universities. Geraldine's innovative generalist radio programs draw from a wide range of Australian and overseas contributors, engaging listeners with the wider world and its thinkers. She's developed this further, most recently, with colleague Hamish MacDonald, into an exciting new collaboration, Global Roaming, a popular podcast and free-to-air on Radio National, about Australia's place in the world. Geraldine is a co-founding member of Catalyst for Renewal and of Spirituality in the Pub, and a great friend to us. So Geraldine, welcome, and thank you again for being with us this evening.
Well, thank you, Susie. And look, that was a wonderful presentation, as I knew it would be, by Michael. It's always slightly daunting on these things to follow Michael, but there, we'll do my best. Now, Maria and your team, Susan's invitation, has invited me, demanded me really, to renovate my understandings of conscience, which apparently we spoke about 30 years ago, a generation back. It's extraordinary to think about. Much has occurred, much has changed in my life and others. Truthfully, I don't think of that word conscience an awful lot these days, I confess, but I had to distill my own sense of reflection on it. And I'd say it's that I feel I'm being asked, like all lay people right now in the church, I think this is what I feel is my conscience, what is asked of me now. What is asked of me now, that's what I think I'm dwelling upon. Conscience, you know, accompanied me as a girl and then as a young woman to a considerable degree. Examining my conscience was something drummed into me by the Mercy nuns. I had a tendency to be what was called a scrupulous child. Confession was both a cleanser and an ordeal. The review of my behaviour, my thoughts, my plans, my sensibilities, was not altogether balanced, I don't think. It stoked my latent anxiety, and I don't think that was the plan at all, but it definitely did so. And I came to reject that process, to be candid, as probably the reverse of what God was seeking from me when I grew up enough to think about it. And I think that that has influenced my reception of the word conscience itself. I don't advise, frankly, some of the downstream effects. I've had to reconsider some of these aspects of life, accompanying my grandchildren now through their first confession, en route to First Communion, and for one of the eldest now confirmation, which we're in the middle of. Is your conscience clear? Now, you don't hear that phrase all too often these days, do you? You might be inclined to hear, is he or she an honourable person? Are they a person of integrity? And very recently, you might even have heard that question, are they a kind person? Very beloved of our newly re-elected Prime Minister. In other words, I think the aspiration is still there, but the notion of reflecting on self, on motives, on fantasies, on angers, on sin, is not exactly centre stage these days because it was not a casualty-free zone. Maybe it shouldn't have been either, but it wasn't. By the way, can you see me? Because I've suddenly gone off. Am I still there?
Yes, we can see you, Geraldine.
Okay, well, something's gone wrong with mine. Simultaneously, we were also acutely cautioned against self-wonder, whether a kinder audit of self was then and is now possible, and likely to receive blessings as well, maybe even likely to equip us better for the task at hand of contributing than were some of those preparations I was given as a young girl for conscience examination. In Pope Francis's words, to be part of the church that is a field hospital for the wounded of life. I mean, I do really love that phrase, and I do feel now I could have been more welcomed into that. So I have turned to some of the giants of the church to help me through this particular challenge of being a bit rusty on this issue. Pope Benedict, for instance, said of the life of Cardinal John Henry Newman that it could be described as one great commentary on the question of conscience. Newman saw conscience in two parts, a moral sense and a sense of duty. The first being first role being theoretical, the other practical. The feeling of conscience, he said, is twofold. It is a moral sense, I'm repeating myself, and a sense of duty, a judgment of the reason and a magisterial dictate. And I'm quoting him here. It's the echo of a voice, imperative and constraining, like no other dictate in the whole of our experience. But it is not the voice of God. That was his interpretation anyway. Conscience is to hear the echo of a moral governor. That is, God is the source of the moral order in the world, the order we're called to discover, to adhere to live and be in accord with. But it's interesting that a multi-part behaviour is required of us, he says. And I find this quite interesting. We have to obey our conscience because it claims to be the echo of the voice of God. But we also have the duty to form it so that it allows God's law to shine through as purely as possible and without refraction. In other words, and this is the trick, it needs to adapt. That sounds so easy, but it's not easy. It is not the truth, he says. It is not the lawmaker, but the search for it. And this chimes very much with my old friend, Dr. Simon Longstaff, on whose board at the St. James Ethics Centre I sat for about 8 years. And he used to constantly go on. Sometimes it sort of annoyed me, but I've been reflecting on it, that it was absolutely no use the centre being called in to organisations that had all these gorgeous placards on the wall listing the organisation's values, beautifully described, fabulous use of language, if the individual employees had no idea of how to internalise this, no means of actually seeing danger loom up that could then, eventually pose sort of existential terror onto the organisation. If people couldn't name the beast and give it a range of different clothes, the beautiful overview, the truth, was useless. Now, Socrates, it seems to me, knew something about this too, with his immortal urge to know thyself. Surely it's a vital safety valve for all of us as a basic preparation for a developed conscience, because we can trick ourselves and manipulate ourselves via our conscience. Here's Newman again. I observe that a civilised age is more exposed to subtle sins than a rude age. Why? For this simple reason. Because it is more fertile in excuses and evasions. It can defend error and hence can blind the eyes of those who have no very careful consciences. It can make effort plausible. It can make vice look like virtue. It dignifies sin by fine names. It calls avarice proper care of one's family or industry. It calls pride independence. It calls ambition greatness of mind. Resentment, it calls proper spirit and sense of honour, etc. Now, I've sought out other guides too of late, like Father Richard Rohr, R-O-H-R, I'm sure a lot of you know him, from the Centre for Spirituality in New Mexico. And he has lovely distilled little nuggets, I think. Throughout all these years, I've tried to pass my words through 3 gates. Is it true? Is it loving? Is it necessary? Because we must be sustained by a sense of what we are for and not just what we're against. The contemplative path isn't primarily about learning, it's about living. Through contemplation, we begin to see differently, to love more deeply and to act with courage. He's introduced me to others. The spiritual writer Christine Valters Paintner suggests we might, and I have been doing this lately, we might adopt a desert practice of asking a teacher or a spiritual advisor for a word or a phrase and then ponder on it for days or weeks or months. That it's intended to be wrestled with and slowly grown into. It's not a theological explanation. It's not counselling. It's part of a relationship developing between an elder and a novice with the assumption of space life-giving, that it's life-giving, and that it's about receiving, designed to hold in your heart, turning it over and over, pondering, not analysing, giving it space within you to speak. Very much what was an emphasis of the early church. And look, sometimes, as I realise I saw in Rome recently, and this is tricky, and Michael referred to this too, it is combined with hard intellectual work. If I think of those cardinals, all men of course, combining their emotional experience of their own church sector, searching themselves to convey to the best of their ability, their conscience, the issues that matter there, but then knowing that there's the awesome burden of pitting these alongside the challenges of the universal church. I was particularly struck in a conversation with Brother Mark O'Connor from the Parramatta Diocese, a Marist brother, with this dilemma, not exactly of conscience, as I'd easily understood it anyway, and maybe we could discuss this. But the more I considered it, the more I thought those men were engaged in this bigger act of conscience. Maybe this is the time, I suggested to Mark, in the coffee shop near the Jesuit Courier, just up the road from the Paul VI Hall, where they hosted the pre-conclave. Maybe this is the time that the church needed to buckle down and hold on through this turbulence everywhere of power changing in the world and sort of steady the ship. Maybe this is exactly the time when the cardinals ought to be doing that. Oh, no, he said, no. This is the time the church needs to offer something that clearly speaks to that turbulent world. This is when its message is crucial. So it hit me. So I turned inward to examine my own approach and to reconsider, to discern, the word of the time, whether I was actually needing to be pulled into a broader political consideration, to which I am much more comfortable these days. That's the point. I think it's much easier to do the broad than it is to go into the searingly personal, which I think you've asked us to do tonight. So to be honest, I am a bit stuck right there, because I think the broader canvas can be easier to deal with, and we need to. But whether we make it the main journey, which very much is of politics, I'm just not sure. And I feel that I need to go back to exactly where I began, that I need to dwell on what this central question is that I think is facing me anyway, and facing Catholic lay people. What is being asked of me now? And that's where I am.
Thank you, Geraldine. What a great question to leave us with. What is being asked of us now?